At the dawn of the 20th century, humanity's relationship with the heavens was about to transform forever. For thousands of years, we had gazed upward at the stars and moon with wonder, creating myths and stories to explain what we saw. But now, a handful of visionaries began to believe that reaching beyond Earth wasn't just a dream. It was an engineering problem waiting to be solved. In Russia, a quiet schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was working through equations that would change everything. Born in 1857, partially deaf from a childhood illness, Tsiolkovsky turned inward to his imagination and mathematics. By the early 1900s, he had published works describing how rockets could operate in the vacuum of space. His insight was profound. He understood that Newton's third law meant rockets didn't need air to push against. They could work anywhere, even in the emptiness beyond our atmosphere. He calculated the rocket equation, showing the relationship between fuel, mass, and velocity. He even proposed using liquid fuels and multi-stage rockets decades before anyone would build them. Across the ocean in America, Robert Goddard was conducting his own experiments. A physics professor with a passion for rocketry, Goddard faced ridicule from the press and skepticism from his peers. In 1920, the New York Times famously mocked him, suggesting he lacked basic knowledge of physics. They couldn't have been more wrong. Goddard wasn't deterred. In 1926, in a frozen field in Massachusetts, he launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It flew for only 2.5 seconds, reaching a height of 41 feet. But it proved the concept worked. Goddard would go on to develop gyroscopic guidance systems, fuel pumps, and multi-stage rockets, filing over 200 patents that would later become fundamental to space exploration. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hermann Oberth was captivating the public imagination. His 1923 book, The Rocket into Planetary Space, laid out the mathematics and engineering principles needed for space travel in terms that inspired a generation. Unlike Tsiolkovsky, who remained relatively obscure in the Soviet Union, Oberth's work reached across Europe. Young engineers and dreamers read his writings and began to believe that space travel wasn't fantasy. It was inevitable. These three men, working independently across 3 continents, are often called the fathers of modern rocketry. They never collaborated, yet their ideas formed a foundation that would support everything that followed. But theory alone wouldn't reach space. That would require the chaos and urgency of war. The 1930s saw rocket societies springing up across the world. In Germany, the Society for Space Travel attracted ambitious young engineers, including a brilliant teenager named Wernher von Braun. These enthusiasts conducted experiments, launched small rockets, and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But as Nazi Germany began its military buildup, the government took notice. Rockets, they realized, could be weapons. By the late 1930s, von Braun and his team were no longer amateur enthusiasts. They were working for the German military at a secret facility called Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. Their mission was to create a revolutionary new weapon, a ballistic missile that could strike targets hundreds of miles away. The result was the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile and the first human-made object to reach space. The V-2 was a marvel of engineering and an instrument of terror. Standing 46 feet tall, powered by liquid oxygen and alcohol, it could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles at speeds exceeding 3,000 miles per hour. It reached altitudes of over 50 miles, crossing the boundary into space before plummeting back to Earth. There was no defense against it. The V-2 traveled faster than sound, so victims heard nothing before impact. Between 1944 and 1945, Germany launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets, primarily at London and Antwerp. They killed thousands of civilians and spread fear across Allied nations. But the rockets also killed thousands during their construction. The Nazis used slave labor from concentration camps to build them in underground factories. The death toll among these prisoners exceeded the number of people killed by the rockets themselves. When World War II ended in 1945, the V-2 program became one of the most sought-after prizes of victory. American, Soviet, and British forces raced to capture the rockets, the blueprints, and most importantly, the scientists who built them. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip, secretly bringing von Braun and over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to the United States. The Soviets captured the Piedmont production facilities and brought their own collection of German experts back to Moscow. The irony wasn't lost on observers then or now. The same technology designed to rain death on cities would become the foundation for humanity's greatest adventure. The same engineers who built weapons for Hitler would soon be building rockets to reach the moon. War had accelerated rocket development by decades, compressing what might have taken generations into just a few years of desperate innovation. As the dust of World War II settled, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their alliance had been one of convenience, and it dissolved almost immediately. The Cold War began, and with it, a new kind of competition. These nations wouldn't just compete economically or militarily. They would compete to prove which system, capitalism or communism, represented humanity's future. And nowhere would this competition be more dramatic, more visible, and more inspiring than in the race to conquer space itself. The spring of 1945 brought more than just the end of the bloodiest war in human history. It brought a scramble. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, intelligence units had specific orders. Find the rockets, find the scientists, and get them before the other side does. The V-2 program wasn't just a weapon system. It was the most advanced rocket technology on Earth, and both the Americans and Soviets knew it would be crucial for whatever came next. The Americans moved first and moved fast. Operation Paperclip, named after the paperclips used to attach new identity documents to files, was one of the most controversial intelligence operations of the early Cold War. The goal was simple: extract German scientists and engineers before the Soviets could reach them. The execution was complicated by an uncomfortable truth. Many of these scientists had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had directly participated in war crimes. Wernher von Braun himself had held rank in the SS. President Truman had explicitly ordered that no ardent Nazis be brought to America. But intelligence officials and military leaders saw things differently. These men had knowledge that couldn't be replicated quickly. The Soviet Union was already grabbing every German scientist they could find. America, they argued, couldn't afford moral luxury when national security was at stake. So the files were sanitized. Nazi Party memberships were downplayed or erased. War crimes allegations were buried. And beginning in 1945, German scientists began arriving in the United States. Wernher von Braun became the prize catch. Charismatic, brilliant, and ambitious, he had already decided his future lay with the Americans rather than the Soviets. He and his top team surrendered to American forces and were quickly shipped across the Atlantic. They arrived at Fort Bliss in Texas, then later moved to Huntsville, Alabama. Their knowledge came with them: thousands of pages of documents, blueprints, and test data. The Americans also seized enough V-2 components to assemble about 100 complete rockets. The Soviets, arriving at Piedmont after the Americans had stripped it, found themselves playing catch-up. But they had their own advantages. They captured the manufacturing facilities and the rail lines full of V-2 components. They also rounded up thousands of German engineers and technicians, though most of the top-tier scientists had already fled west. These Germans were taken to the Soviet Union, where they would spend years helping to recreate and improve upon the V-2 technology. Leading the Soviet rocket program was Sergei Korolev, a man whose name would remain secret for decades. During the 1930s, Korolev had been one of the Soviet Union's brightest young rocket engineers. Then Stalin's purges swept him up. Accused of sabotage in 1938, he was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. He survived brutal conditions in gold mines in Siberia, lost most of his teeth to scurvy and beatings, and would suffer health problems for the rest of his life. But his engineering skills saved him. He was transferred to a special prison where scientists worked on military projects. After the war, Stalin recognized the importance of rockets, and Korolev was released, his conviction quietly erased. If von Braun was charismatic in public, Korolev was secretive and driven. He understood that in Stalin's Soviet Union, failure meant death or worse. Success meant survival and perhaps redemption. He threw himself into understanding everything the Germans had achieved and then surpassing it. Where von Braun had funding problems and military skepticism to overcome in America, Korolev had Stalin's paranoia and the NKVD looking over his shoulder. Both men were brilliant, both were driven, and both would shape the space race in ways neither could fully imagine in those early post-war years. The late 1940s saw both superpowers testing captured and reverse-engineered V-2 rockets. The Americans launched theirs from White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Some carried scientific instruments to measure cosmic rays and photograph Earth from high altitude. These weren't just weapons tests anymore. They were the first American experiments in space science. Scientists from universities and research institutions clamored for space on these flights. A new field was being born. The Soviets conducted their tests at a secret facility called Kapustin Yar. Security was absolute. The West knew something was happening, but had few details. The Soviets modified the German designs, improving them, making them more reliable. They were learning, systematically and thoroughly. By the late 1940s, they were building their own versions of the V-2, no longer dependent on captured German hardware. But both nations quickly realized the V-2, impressive as it was, wasn't enough. Its range was too short for the new strategic realities of the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union were separated by vast distances. To threaten each other's homelands, they would need missiles that could fly thousands of miles, not hundreds. They would need intercontinental ballistic missiles, and developing those would require pushing rocket technology far beyond anything the Germans had achieved. In America, the military establishment was divided. The Air Force, Army, and Navy all wanted control of missile programs. Each service pushed its own designs and competed for funding. Von Braun and his team worked for the Army, developing the Redstone rocket, an improved V-2 design. But the Air Force had its own programs. So did the Navy. The result was duplication, competition, and sometimes wasteful rivalry. American rocket development in the late 1940s and early 1950s was brilliant but chaotic. The Soviets had a different problem. Stalin's paranoia meant that rival design bureaus were often kept separate, competing against each other for resources and favor. But this competition was subordinate to the state's overwhelming priority: develop an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of striking America. Everything else was secondary. Korolev's bureau focused on this mission with single-minded intensity. By the early 1950s, both sides had made enormous progress. The Americans were testing longer-range missiles. The Soviets were doing the same. But there was a crucial difference. American leadership didn't yet see space as a priority. Missiles were weapons, tools for deterrence. The Soviets, particularly Korolev, saw something more. They understood that whoever could build a missile powerful enough to reach across continents could also build a rocket powerful enough to reach orbit. And that meant space wasn't just a distant dream anymore. It was almost within reach. The pieces were falling into place. The scientists were ready. The technology was advancing. The political will, at least in the Soviet Union, was building. What was needed now was a spark, something to ignite public imagination and political commitment. That spark would come in 1957, and it would shock the world. The summer of 1955 brought an announcement that seemed routine at the time, but would prove anything but. President Eisenhower revealed that the United States would launch an artificial satellite during the International Geophysical Year, a period of coordinated scientific research scheduled for 1957 and 1958. The announcement was framed as a peaceful scientific endeavor, a demonstration of American technological prowess. The satellite would be small, about the size of a basketball, and would orbit Earth while transmitting scientific data. It seemed ambitious but achievable. What most Americans didn't know was that this announcement masked intense internal debate. The military wanted satellites for reconnaissance, to spy on the Soviet Union from orbit. But Eisenhower worried about the implications. If America launched a military satellite, would the Soviets see it as an act of aggression? Would they claim America was violating their airspace? The president wanted to establish a principle. Space was free territory, open to all. So the first American satellite would be civilian, scientific, and unthreatening. It would set a precedent that would later allow military spy satellites to operate without international incident. For days after the American announcement, the Soviet Union made its own declaration. They too would launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year. The statement was brief and received little attention in the Western press. Most American officials dismissed it as propaganda. The Soviets, they believed, were years behind American technology. There was no way they could actually pull it off. This assumption would prove to be one of the greatest intelligence failures of the Cold War. Behind the Iron Curtain, Sergei Korolev saw his opportunity. He had been pushing Soviet leadership to approve a satellite program, but had faced resistance. Missiles were the priority, not scientific toys. But now, with the Americans making their announcement, national prestige was at stake. Korolev argued that a satellite launch would demonstrate Soviet technological superiority and show the world that communist science could surpass capitalist achievement. He got his approval, but with conditions. The satellite work couldn't interfere with military missile development. It would have to be done quickly and with existing hardware. Korolev had been developing a massive rocket called the R-7, designed to carry nuclear warheads to America. It was a monster, using multiple engines clustered together, capable of generating tremendous thrust. If it worked, the R-7 would be powerful enough to put a satellite into orbit. In fact, it was far more powerful than necessary for that task. The Americans were planning to use a modified Viking research rocket for their satellite. Korolev would be using an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but it would work. The R-7 tests began in 1957, and they were disasters. The first launch in May exploded shortly after liftoff. The second attempt in June failed when a fuel line ruptured. These were setbacks, but Korolev pressed forward with relentless determination. He made modifications, fixed problems, and pushed his team day and night. On August 21, 1957, the R-7 finally completed a successful test flight. It flew over 4,000 miles, and its dummy warhead landed in the target area in Kamchatka. The Soviets now had the world's first operational intercontinental ballistic missile, and they had their launch vehicle for a satellite. In America, the satellite program was moving forward but slowly. The Navy's Vanguard rocket, selected for the mission, was an elegant design but untested and complex. There were delays, technical problems, and bureaucratic tangles. Von Braun and his Army team lobbied to be allowed to launch America's satellite. They had the Redstone rocket, already proven, and claimed they could put a satellite in orbit within months. But the decision had been made. Vanguard would carry America's first satellite. The Army would have to wait. Korolev wasn't waiting. With the R-7 proven, he pushed for an immediate satellite launch. The original plan had been for a sophisticated satellite loaded with scientific instruments, but that would take months to prepare. Instead, Korolev proposed something simpler, a polished metal sphere, about the size of a beach ball, containing batteries, a radio transmitter, and little else. It would do one thing: broadcast a simple beeping signal that anyone with a radio receiver could hear. It wouldn't return scientific data or serve any military purpose, but it would be first. And in the space race that was about to begin, being first was everything. On October 4, 1957, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the R-7 rocket roared to life. Korolev and his team watched as their creation lifted off, carrying the world's first artificial satellite. They called it Sputnik, meaning fellow traveler in Russian. The launch was perfect. 9 minutes after liftoff, Sputnik separated from the rocket and entered orbit, circling Earth every 96 minutes at an altitude ranging from about 140 to 580 miles. The radio signals began immediately. Beep, beep, beep. A simple, rhythmic pulse broadcasting on frequencies that amateur radio operators around the world could receive. Soviet scientists announced the achievement, providing the radio frequencies and orbital parameters. Within hours, people across the globe were listening to that beeping sound coming from space. They were hearing humanity's first voice from beyond Earth, and it was speaking Russian. The reaction in America was shock, fear, and humiliation. How had the Soviets beaten us? What did this mean for national security? If they could launch a satellite, They could drop a nuclear bomb anywhere in America. The technology was identical. Suddenly, the ocean barriers that had always protected the United States meant nothing. America was vulnerable, and everyone knew it. The press called it the Sputnik crisis. Newspapers ran alarming headlines. Television news showed Americans staring at the night sky, watching for the tiny moving point of light that was Sputnik passing overhead. The beeping became a symbol of Soviet achievement and American failure. Politicians demanded answers. How had American intelligence missed this? Why wasn't America first? What were we going to do about it? President Eisenhower tried to downplay the achievement. It was, he said, just a small ball in space. It posed no military threat. American missile programs were progressing well. There was no reason for panic. But his reassurances fell flat. The public didn't care about classified missile programs. They cared about what they could see and hear. And what they could see and hear was a Soviet satellite circling overhead every 90 minutes, broadcasting its message of communist technological superiority. Democrats in Congress, sensing political opportunity, attacked the Republican administration. Senator Lyndon Johnson held hearings that painted a dire picture of American technological decline. The Democrats called for massive investment in science education, missile development, and space technology. The term missile gap entered the political vocabulary, suggesting America had fallen dangerously behind the Soviets in strategic weapons. Whether this gap actually existed was debatable, but politically it was devastating. The Soviets, delighted by the panic they'd caused, weren't finished. Just 1 month later, on November 3rd, they launched Sputnik 2. This satellite was far larger, weighing over 1,000 pounds compared to Sputnik 1's 184 pounds. And it carried a passenger, a dog named Laika. She was a stray picked up from the streets of Moscow, trained for the mission, and placed inside a pressurized capsule with food, water, and life support systems. Laika's flight was one way. The technology to return her safely didn't exist yet. Soviet officials initially claimed she survived for several days before being euthanized. The truth, revealed decades later, was that she died within hours from overheating when the thermal control system failed. But at the time, Laika became an international sensation. The Soviets had not just launched a satellite. They'd launched a living creature into orbit and kept it alive, at least briefly. If they could do that, how long before they launched a human being? American officials scrambled to respond. The Vanguard team was pushed to accelerate their schedule. In December 1957, just 2 months after Sputnik's launch, the Navy attempted to launch their satellite. The attempt was televised live, promoted as America's answer to Soviet achievement. It was a disaster. The rocket rose about 4 feet, lost thrust, settled back onto the launch pad, and exploded in a massive fireball. The satellite was thrown clear and lay on the ground, still beeping pitifully. The press called it Flopnik and Kaputnik. The humiliation was complete. Finally, the Army got its chance. Von Braun's team worked around the clock, preparing a modified Redstone rocket called Juno 1. On January 31, 1958, it successfully launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite. The satellite was small, weighing only about 30 pounds, but it was in orbit. America had finally joined the space age. Explorer 1 even made an important scientific discovery, detecting the radiation belts surrounding Earth that would later be named after scientist James Van Allen. But being first had already gone to the Soviets. America was playing catch-up, and everyone knew it. The psychological impact of Sputnik couldn't be overstated. It shattered American assumptions about technological superiority. It created a sense of urgency about science and engineering education. It made space exploration a national priority. And it transformed what had been a quiet competition between missile programs into a very public, very intense race to demonstrate which superpower could achieve the most impressive feats beyond Earth. Within months of Sputnik's launch, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This new civilian agency would coordinate America's space efforts, pulling together various military and civilian programs under one umbrella. NASA officially began operations on October 1, 1958, exactly 1 year after Sputnik shocked the world. The space race was no longer theoretical. It was real, urgent, and all-consuming. Both superpowers now had dedicated space programs. Both were pushing their engineers to achieve faster, fly higher, and go farther than the other side. And the question on everyone's mind was no longer whether humans would go to space. It was which humans would get there first. The question wasn't if humans would fly in space. It was who would go first. By 1959, both the United States and Soviet Union had active programs to put a person into orbit. The technical challenges were immense. A satellite could be small, simple, and expendable. A human passenger changed everything. You needed life support, temperature control, radiation shielding, and most critically, a way to bring your astronaut home alive. The engineering was daunting, but the political and propaganda value of winning this race made it worth any cost. The Americans called their program Mercury. It was designed around a simple philosophy. Keep it straightforward, test everything thoroughly, and don't take unnecessary risks. The Mercury capsule was small, barely large enough for one person in a pressure suit. The astronaut wouldn't really pilot the craft so much as ride inside it while automated systems handled most functions. Critics joked that the first American in space would be spam in a can. But the engineers argued this approach was safest. Prove the concept first, then add complexity. In April 1959, NASA introduced the Mercury 7, the first American astronauts. They were all military test pilots, chosen from hundreds of volunteers. Their names became instantly famous: Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton. They were portrayed as clean-cut heroes, all-American men with the right stuff. The media loved them. Life magazine secured exclusive rights to their personal stories. They became celebrities before any of them had flown. The Soviets took a different approach. Korolev's team selected 20 candidates from Air Force fighter pilots. They had to meet strict criteria: under 5 feet 7 inches tall to fit in the cramped Vostok capsule, under 30 years old, in perfect health, and ideally from peasant or working-class backgrounds for propaganda purposes. The program was secret. Unlike the American astronauts who trained under media scrutiny, the Soviet cosmonauts worked in complete secrecy. The world wouldn't learn their names until after they flew. If they flew successfully, failure would be hidden. Among the Soviet candidates was Yuri Gagarin, a 25-year-old senior lieutenant with a warm smile and unflappable demeanor. He wasn't the most skilled pilot in the group, but he had something else: charisma, a calm confidence, and the political background the Soviet leadership wanted. His father had been a carpenter, his mother a dairy farmer. He represented the Soviet ideal of the common man achieving greatness through communist society. Both programs pushed forward through 1960, testing their hardware with unmanned flights. The Americans launched chimpanzees named Ham and Enos on suborbital and orbital flights. The missions were partially successful, but revealed problems that needed fixing. The Soviets flew dogs, including several successful orbital missions, but they also had failures kept secret from the world. In December 1960, a launch pad explosion killed over 100 people, including a top military official. The disaster was completely concealed for decades. Behind the scenes, both programs faced the same terrifying question: was it safe enough? The rockets were modified missiles, never designed to carry humans. The capsules were new, unproven technology. One mistake, one system failure, and the person inside would die, probably on live television if it was an American flight. The pressure on engineers and managers was crushing. They were being ordered to move fast, to beat the other side, but also to not kill national heroes. By early 1961, both sides were nearly ready. The Americans planned a cautious approach. First, a 15-minute suborbital flight that would just barely reach space before splashing down in the Atlantic. Only after proving that would they attempt a full orbit. The Soviets were going directly for orbit on their first manned flight. It was riskier but potentially more impressive. And in the space race, impressive was the point. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin climbed into Vostok 1 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. He had been selected just days before. The backup cosmonaut German Titov stood by. There had been concerns about the mission. Recent test flights had problems. Some engineers recommended delays. But Korolev pushed forward. He knew the Americans were close. This was the moment. The hatch closed. Gagarin waited as systems were checked and rechecked. At 9:07 Moscow time, the rockets ignited. Gagarin's heart rate, monitored by telemetry, jumped to 150. As the rocket accelerated, he reportedly said poetically, meaning "let's go," or "off we go." It became one of the most famous utterances in history. The launch was perfect. 9 minutes later, Vostok 1 was in orbit, carrying the first human being beyond Earth's atmosphere. For 108 minutes, Gagarin circled the planet. He described what he saw through his window: the curvature of Earth, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, the blackness of space, and the incredible brightness of the sun without atmosphere to filter it. He ate food from tubes, tested his ability to write notes in weightlessness, and monitored his instruments. The capsule was mostly automatic, but he had a sealed envelope with a code to unlock manual controls if needed. He never opened it. Re-entry was the most dangerous phase. The Vostok capsule wasn't designed for a gentle landing. Instead, at about 23,000 feet, Gagarin would eject and parachute separately while the capsule crashed. This detail was kept secret because international aviation records required the pilot to land with the craft. The Soviets would falsely claim he landed inside Vostok for years. But the plan worked. Gagarin ejected, parachuted into a field near the Volga River, and was found by confused local farmers who couldn't quite believe his story about coming from space. The announcement shocked the world. The Soviet Union had done it again. They had beaten America to another crucial milestone. Gagarin became an instant global celebrity, his grinning face appearing on newspapers and magazines everywhere. The Soviets organized a massive propaganda campaign. Gagarin toured the world, meeting heads of state, receiving medals and honors. He was living proof of Soviet technological superiority and the triumph of communism. In America, the reaction was a mixture of admiration and frustration. President Kennedy, newly inaugurated just 3 months earlier, was furious. He had been briefed that the space program was progressing well. Now the Soviets had achieved something unprecedented, and America had nothing to show in response. Kennedy called meetings with his advisors. What could America do? What spectacular achievement could capture the public imagination and prove American superiority? 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, Alan Shepard finally got his chance. On May 5, 1961, he rode a Redstone rocket on a 15-minute suborbital flight. Freedom 7, his Mercury capsule, reached an altitude of 116 miles before splashing down in the Atlantic. It wasn't orbit. It wasn't even close to what Gagarin had done, but it was something. America had put a man in space, brought him back, and done it on live television. Millions watched. Shepard became a national hero, but everyone knew he was second. Kennedy was thinking bigger now. He had been receiving proposals from NASA and his science advisors. They wanted a bold goal, something dramatic that would justify massive funding and capture public imagination. Landing a man on the moon kept coming up. It was technically achievable, probably, but would require enormous resources. The Soviets had more powerful rockets currently, but American industrial capacity was greater. If the race was to the moon, America might actually win. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech covered many topics, but one passage would define the decade. He said America should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project would be more impressive or more important for the long-range exploration of space, he argued, and none would be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. The reaction was mixed. Some congressmen were thrilled by the bold vision. Others worried about the cost, estimated at over $20 billion. Scientists debated whether it was worth it compared to other research. But Kennedy had made his decision. The moon was the goal. Everything else would be secondary to that mission. America was all in. The Soviets were watching carefully. Korolev wanted desperately to go to the moon. He had wanted it even before Kennedy's speech. But the Soviet leadership was more cautious about committing to such an expensive program. They were content for now to keep racking up firsts in Earth orbit. And they had more impressive feats coming soon. In August 1961, German Titov became the second person in space, flying Vostok 2 for a full day in orbit, completing 17 orbits. It was another demonstration of Soviet capability. The Americans wouldn't match a full orbital flight until February 1962, when John Glenn orbited Earth 3 times aboard Friendship 7. Glenn's flight was a huge moment for American morale. He became arguably the most famous astronaut of all, the first American to orbit Earth, returning to a ticker-tape parade in New York and a meeting with the president. The early 1960s saw a flurry of Mercury flights. Americans were catching up in experience, even if the Soviets had more powerful rockets. Scott Carpenter orbited 3 times in May 1962. Wally Schirra orbited 6 times in October. Gordon Cooper completed 22 orbits in May 1963, bringing the Mercury program to a successful close. Each flight built confidence, tested new procedures, and proved that Americans could match Soviet achievements in orbit. The Soviets, meanwhile, pulled off more propaganda coups. In June 1963, they launched Vostok 6 carrying Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. She was a textile factory worker and amateur parachutist, selected partially for propaganda value. Her flight lasted nearly 3 days and 48 orbits. It would be 19 years before America sent a woman into space. The Soviets had scored another first, and they made sure the world knew about it. But beneath the surface, both programs were facing challenges. The Mercury capsules and Vostok spacecraft were limited. They could prove humans could survive in space, but they couldn't do much beyond that. Going to the moon would require much more sophisticated capabilities. Astronauts would need to maneuver their spacecraft, rendezvous and dock with other vehicles, walk in space, and spend extended periods in orbit. Neither country had demonstrated any of these abilities yet. The race was about to enter a new phase. The simple capsules and brief missions of the early 1960s had proven the concept. Now both nations needed to develop the techniques and technologies that would actually enable a moon mission. The Americans called their next program Gemini. The Soviets would continue with an upgraded Voskhod program. Both sides were learning, both were advancing, and both were pushing toward that ultimate goal, landing on another world. The era of simply getting to space was over. Now came the era of learning how to work in space, preparing for the greatest journey humanity had ever attempted. By 1964, the space race had evolved beyond simple demonstrations. Both superpowers understood that reaching the moon required mastering techniques no one had yet attempted. Spacecraft would need to change orbits, meet up with other vehicles, and dock together. Astronauts would need to leave their capsules and work in the vacuum of space. Missions would need to last days, or even weeks. These weren't just engineering challenges. They were potential death traps if anything went wrong. NASA's Gemini program was designed specifically to develop these capabilities. The name came from the constellation representing twins, appropriate because the Gemini capsule carried 2 astronauts instead of Mercury's 1. The spacecraft was larger, more capable, and far more complex. It had onboard computers for navigation, thrusters for maneuvering, and fuel cells for power. Most importantly, it could actually be piloted. The astronauts weren't just passengers anymore. They were flying. The first manned Gemini mission, Gemini 3, launched in March 1965, with Gus Grissom and John Young aboard. It was a short flight, just 3 orbits, but it proved the spacecraft worked. Grissom, who had nearly drowned after his Mercury flight when his capsule sank, was relieved when this landing went smoothly. The mission tested the spacecraft's ability to change its orbit, something no one had done before. It worked perfectly. America was learning how to fly in space, not just ride in space. But 10 days before Gemini 3 launched, the Soviets pulled off another spectacular first. On March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov opened the hatch of Voskhod 2 and floated out into space. He was connected only by a tether, wearing a pressure suit, surrounded by nothing but vacuum. For 12 minutes, he became the first human to walk in space, or as the Soviets called it, perform an extravehicular activity. The images were stunning. A human floating against the curve of Earth, tethered to his spacecraft, with the blackness of space behind him. It looked effortless. What the Soviets didn't reveal was how close Leonov came to dying. His suit had ballooned in the vacuum, making it rigid and difficult to move. When he tried to re-enter the airlock, he couldn't fit. He was stuck outside, his oxygen running low, desperately trying to squeeze back through the hatch. Finally, he did something terrifying and brilliant. He partially depressurized his suit, making it flexible enough to contort his body and get back inside. He was minutes from death. The mission had other problems too. The automatic re-entry system failed. The crew had to manually fire their retro rockets, something never done before. They landed hundreds of miles off target in a dense forest in the Ural Mountains, in deep snow, in temperatures well below freezing. It took 2 days for rescue crews to reach them. They spent the night in their capsule, surrounded by wolves, burning whatever they could for warmth. The Soviets reported the mission as a complete success. The terrifying details remained secret for decades. 3 months later, in June 1965, America had its own spacewalk. Ed White opened the hatch of Gemini 4 and floated out, connected by a gold-colored tether. He had a handheld maneuvering unit that let him propel himself using compressed gas. For 23 minutes, he floated, spun, and maneuvered outside his spacecraft. His partner, James McDivitt, took photographs that became iconic images of the space race. When Mission Control ordered White back inside, he reportedly said it was the saddest moment of his life. Being outside in space was incredible. White's spacewalk was more controlled and successful than Leonov's, though the Americans didn't know about the Soviet problems at the time. NASA was methodically working through its checklist of required capabilities. Each Gemini mission added new achievements. Gemini 5 in August 1965 stayed in orbit for 8 days, proving astronauts could survive long enough for a moon mission. Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad endured boredom, equipment failures, and the physical toll of weightlessness, but they proved it was possible. The real breakthrough came with Gemini 6 and 7 in December 1965. The missions were flown simultaneously. Gemini 7, with Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, launched first and would stay up for 2 weeks. Gemini 6, with Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, would launch later and rendezvous with them. This was critical. Going to the moon required linking up 2 spacecraft in orbit. If America couldn't master this, the moon landing was impossible. The Gemini 6 launch was postponed when their target vehicle, an unmanned Agena rocket, exploded during its launch. Mission planners made a bold decision. Use Gemini 7 as the target instead. On December 15th, Gemini 6 launched and began chasing Gemini 7. Using careful thruster burns and navigation calculations, Schirra maneuvered his spacecraft closer and closer. 6 hours after launch, the 2 spacecraft were flying in formation, just a few feet apart. They didn't dock, there was no docking equipment, but they proved rendezvous was possible. They orbited together for 5 hours, the crews waving at each other through their windows, before Gemini 6 returned to Earth. The Soviets watched these achievements with growing concern. The Americans were catching up. The Gemini program was methodically demonstrating every capability needed for a moon landing. The Soviet program, meanwhile, was struggling. After Leonov's spacewalk, they had achieved little. Political infighting, funding problems, and technical difficulties were slowing them down. Korolev was pushing for a lunar program, but getting approval and resources was difficult. Gemini continued its string of successes through 1966. Gemini 8 in March, with Neil Armstrong and David Scott, achieved the first docking between 2 spacecraft. They connected with an unmanned Agena target vehicle, a perfect docking on their first attempt. But minutes later, disaster nearly struck. A thruster stuck open, causing the joined spacecraft to spin faster and faster. Armstrong, thinking the problem was in the Agena, undocked. The spinning accelerated. They were tumbling end over end, once per second, on the edge of blacking out. Armstrong shut down the main thrusters and used the re-entry system thrusters to stabilize. They survived, but it was close. It was also a reminder that space was unforgiving. Later Gemini missions perfected the techniques. Gemini 9 with Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan performed more rendezvous practice. Cernan attempted an ambitious spacewalk, but found the work exhausting. His visor fogged up from sweat. He overheated. The spacewalk had to be cut short. Working in space was harder than anyone expected. The experience led to major changes in how NASA planned and trained for spacewalks. Gemini 10, with John Young and Michael Collins docked with one Agena, used its engines to reach a higher orbit, then rendezvoused with another Agena from a previous mission. Collins performed 2 spacewalks. Gemini 11 in September reached a record altitude of 850 miles, high enough to see Earth as a complete sphere. Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon tested a tether between their spacecraft and the Agena, creating artificial gravity by spinning. Gemini 12 in November, with Jim Lovell and Buzz Aldrin, brought the program to a triumphant close. Aldrin performed multiple spacewalks, totaling over 5 hours, proving that with proper procedures and training, astronauts could work effectively outside their spacecraft. By the end of the Gemini program in late 1966, America had achieved everything needed for a moon mission. 10 manned flights in 20 months. Rendezvous and docking mastered. Spacewalking proven. Long-duration flights accomplished. The Americans had gone from being behind the Soviets to being clearly ahead in practical spaceflight capability. The Soviets, meanwhile, were facing a crisis. They had achieved early spectacular firsts, but they were falling behind in developing the systems needed for a moon landing. Their Voskhod program had scored propaganda victories, like Leonov's spacewalk and the 3-person Voskhod 1 mission in 1964. But these were risky stunts, more than systematic capability development. The Voskhod spacecraft was a modified Vostok, cramped and limited. The 3 cosmonauts on Voskhod 1 hadn't even worn pressure suits because there wasn't room. If anything had gone wrong, they would have died. Worse, the Soviet space program was in organizational chaos. Multiple design bureaus competed for resources and favor. Different groups pushed competing rocket designs for the moon mission. There was no equivalent to NASA, no single agency coordinating everything. And in January 1966, tragedy struck. Sergei Korolev, the driving force behind Soviet space achievements, died during surgery at age 59. His years in the Gulag had destroyed his health. His death was a devastating blow to Soviet ambitions. Korolev's death was kept secret from the world. The Soviets never revealed his identity publicly during his lifetime. He was always referred to in news reports as the chief designer. Only after his death was his name released. His deputy, Vasily Mishin, took over, but he lacked Korolev's political skills and visionary leadership. The Soviet moon program, already struggling, would suffer further under the new management. By late 1966, the space race had reached a turning point. America had a clear program. The Apollo spacecraft was being developed, the massive Saturn V rocket was being tested, and the Gemini program had proven all the necessary techniques. The goal was clear and the path was mapped out. The Soviets had more powerful rockets currently in service, but their lunar program was disorganized, underfunded, and had lost its leader. The question was no longer if America could reach the moon. It was whether they could do it before the end of the decade, as Kennedy had promised, and whether they could do it without losing astronauts in the attempt. The hardware was getting bigger, more complex, and more powerful. The risks were growing. Both nations had been lucky so far. No one had died in space, but everyone involved in the programs knew that luck wouldn't last forever. The worst was yet to come, and it would arrive in 1967, testing the resolve of both superpowers and reminding everyone that space exploration demanded not just ambition and engineering, but also sacrifice. January 27, 1967, started as a routine day at Cape Kennedy. The Apollo 1 crew was conducting a launch rehearsal, a plugs-out test designed to verify that the spacecraft could operate on internal power. It wasn't considered particularly dangerous. The rocket wasn't fueled. The crew would sit in the command module for several hours, running through checklists, while ground controllers monitored systems. It was tedious work, but necessary. The crew consisted of 3 experienced astronauts. Gus Grissom, a Mercury and Gemini veteran, was the commander. Ed White, America's first spacewalker, was the senior pilot. Roger Chaffee, the rookie, was the pilot. All 3 knew the Apollo spacecraft had problems. There had been so many issues during construction and testing that Grissom had hung a lemon on it as a joke. But NASA was behind schedule, and pressure to catch up was intense. The test began in the afternoon. The crew entered the command module, and the hatch was sealed. It was a complicated three-part hatch that opened inward and took at least 90 seconds to open, even under ideal conditions. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure. This was standard procedure for Apollo. Pure oxygen was simpler than an oxygen-nitrogen mix, reduced weight, and lowered the risk of decompression sickness. But it also made everything inside extraordinarily flammable. Problems plagued the test from the start. There were communications issues, a sour smell in the oxygen system, minor glitches with equipment. At 6:31 in the evening, during a hold in the countdown, the crew was still sealed inside, frustrated by the delays. Then, suddenly, sensors detected a power surge. Seconds later, someone on the crew, probably Chafee, said fire. Then White's voice, more urgent, fire in the cockpit. What happened next took less than 15 seconds. The fire spread with terrifying speed in the pure oxygen environment. Flames consumed the interior of the capsule. The pressure inside skyrocketed as materials burned and outgassed. The hull ruptured. Thick smoke poured out. The crew tried desperately to open the hatch, but it was impossible. The pressure differential made it immovable, and their hands were burning. They couldn't see through the smoke. By the time technicians outside could get the hatch open, fighting through heat and toxic fumes without proper equipment, all 3 astronauts were dead. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and damning. The command module had been filled with flammable materials. Velcro, nylon netting, foam padding, all of it caught fire easily in the oxygen-rich atmosphere. Wiring was exposed and frayed in places. The cabin pressure had been higher than it would be in flight, making conditions even more dangerous. The hatch design was terrible, and the choice to use pure oxygen in a ground test at sea level pressure, rather than the lower pressure used in space, had created a death trap. NASA was devastated. These weren't just casualties. They were preventable deaths caused by negligence and schedule pressure. The Apollo program ground to a halt. Congressional hearings were brutal. How had NASA allowed this to happen? Why had so many safety concerns been ignored? The agency faced questions about whether it could safely send anyone to the moon. Some wondered if Kennedy's deadline had pushed NASA to take reckless chances. The spacecraft was completely redesigned. The hatch was changed to open outward and could now be opened in seconds. Flammable materials were removed and replaced with fire-resistant alternatives. Wiring was better insulated and protected. The oxygen system was redesigned to use a nitrogen-oxygen mix during ground testing and only pure oxygen in the reduced pressure of space. Every system was reviewed and improved. The changes took months and delayed the program significantly, but they were absolutely necessary. The fire broke something in the American space program's culture of invincibility. For 6 years, despite dangerous missions and close calls, no American had died during a space mission. The streak was over. The space program had claimed its first victims, and it happened not in the vastness of space, but on the ground, during a test that was supposed to be safe. The tragedy was a brutal reminder that space exploration was dangerous and unforgiving. 3 months after the Apollo 1 fire, the Soviet Union faced its own catastrophe. Vladimir Komarov was a highly experienced cosmonaut, a veteran who had flown on Voskhod 1. In April 1967, he was assigned to command Soyuz 1, the first flight of the Soviet Union's new spacecraft designed for moon missions. The Soyuz was more advanced than previous Soviet spacecraft, but it was also rushed and plagued with problems. Engineers identified over 200 design flaws before launch. Some recommended postponement, but political pressure and the desire to score a propaganda victory on the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution pushed the mission forward. Komarov knew the spacecraft wasn't ready. According to some accounts, he accepted the mission because his backup was Yuri Gagarin, the national hero. If Komarov refused, Gagarin would fly, and Komarov wouldn't let him die in a flawed spacecraft. Whether this story is entirely accurate remains debated, but it reflects the pressure and tragic circumstances surrounding the flight. Soyuz 1 launched on April 23, 1967. Problems began immediately. One of the solar panels failed to deploy, cutting power generation in half. The spacecraft tumbled. Attitude control was difficult. Communications were intermittent. The planned second launch of Soyuz 2, which would have rendezvoused and docked with Komarov's spacecraft, was canceled. The mission was cut short. Komarov would come home after just 1 day instead of 3. Re-entry began normally, but then catastrophe struck. The main parachute failed to deploy properly. It tangled and didn't open. Komarov activated the backup parachute, but it became fouled with the drogue chute and also failed. Soyuz 1 accelerated toward the ground with no functioning parachutes. Komarov was fully aware of what was happening. Ground control could hear him during the descent. Some reports suggest he was cursing the people who had built the spacecraft and approved its launch. He knew he was going to die. Soyuz 1 hit the ground near Orenburg at over 400 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The spacecraft was crushed, and its fuel tanks exploded. Komarov's remains were barely identifiable. He became the first human to die during a space mission, and his death was as horrible as anyone in the space programs had feared. The Soviet Union held a state funeral. Komarov's ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall, but the details of what went wrong were classified for decades. The Soyuz program was suspended. Like NASA after Apollo 1, the Soviets conducted a thorough review and redesign. The parachute system was completely reworked. Many other systems were improved. But unlike NASA, the Soviets didn't publicly acknowledge the extent of the problems or the reasons for Komarov's death. Officially, the parachute had become tangled due to bad luck. The deeper issues of rushed development and ignored engineering concerns remained hidden. Both space programs now faced a terrible reality. Space travel was deadly. The statistics had caught up with them. Years of increasingly risky missions had finally resulted in fatalities. Both nations had lost experienced, beloved astronauts and cosmonauts. The public support that had sustained the space race was shaken. Was it worth it? Were we sacrificing lives for propaganda and national pride? The year 1967 was a dark time for space exploration. No American flew in space that entire year while Apollo was redesigned. The Soviets flew nothing after Komarov's death until October. The momentum that had been building through the early and mid-1960s seemed to halt. Critics questioned whether the moon race should continue. The cost was enormous. The danger was proven. And for what? To plant a flag before the other side did? But both programs continued. The engineers who had worked with Grissom, White, and Chaffee were determined their deaths wouldn't be in vain. The cosmonauts who had known Komarov demanded that the program continue and be made safer. The political leadership in both nations, despite the setbacks, remained committed to winning the space race. Too much had been invested. Too much was at stake. The disasters of 1967 actually improved both programs in the long run. The forced halt allowed for thorough reviews and improvements that might not have happened under the relentless pressure to move faster. The redesigned Apollo Command Module was significantly safer than the version that killed the Apollo 1 crew. The improved Soyuz spacecraft, though it would have more problems ahead, was more reliable than Soyuz 1. The tragedies created a greater awareness of risk and a stronger safety culture, at least temporarily. By late 1967, both programs were preparing to resume flight. The Americans would return with unmanned Apollo tests. The Soviets would cautiously resume Soyuz flights. The race to the moon would continue, but it would proceed with the knowledge that space exploration demanded sacrifice. Those sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten, and they wouldn't be wasted. The astronauts and cosmonauts who would fly in the coming years would be flying on spacecraft, improved by the hard lessons of 1967, built on the foundation of tragedy and determined to ensure that Grissom, White, Chaffee, and Komarov hadn't died for nothing. The year 1968 began with uncertainty. America's Apollo program was recovering from the fire that had killed 3 astronauts. The Soviet Union's Soyuz program was struggling with reliability issues. Neither nation had sent humans into space in months. The goal of landing on the moon before 1970 seemed increasingly unlikely. But 1968 would transform from a year of doubt into a year of astonishing achievement that set the stage for humanity's greatest adventure. NASA's return to flight began cautiously, with unmanned tests. Apollo 4, in November 1967, had successfully tested the massive Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built. Standing 363 feet tall, generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the Saturn V was necessary because going to the moon required lifting tremendous weight into Earth orbit and then pushing it toward the moon. Nothing else came close to this capability. Apollo 5 in January 1968 tested the lunar module, the spider-like craft that would actually land on the moon. Apollo 6 in April was another Saturn V test, though it experienced engine problems that needed fixing. The next flight, Apollo 7, would carry astronauts. In October 1968, Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walter Cunningham spent 11 days in Earth orbit testing the redesigned command and service modules. The mission was a complete success technically, though the crew developed head cold in space, making them irritable, and Schirra's sharp exchanges with mission control became legendary. But the spacecraft worked flawlessly. America was back in the space business. The Soviets were watching nervously. They had intelligence suggesting NASA was planning something dramatic. The Soviet lunar program was in disarray. Their giant N-1 moon rocket wasn't ready. Their Soyuz spacecraft was still having problems. In September, they had sent Zond 5, an unmanned spacecraft, around the moon and back. It carried turtles, flies, and other biological specimens. The mission proved they could send a living payload to the moon and return it, though the re-entry was rough enough that it would have seriously injured any cosmonauts aboard. Still, it was a propaganda victory. The Soviets were still in the race. Then NASA made a bold decision that shocked even their own astronauts. Apollo 8 had originally been planned as another Earth orbit mission, testing the lunar module in space. But the lunar module wasn't ready. It was behind schedule and having technical problems. Meanwhile, intelligence suggested the Soviets might be planning to send cosmonauts around the moon by the end of 1968. NASA leadership, particularly George Low and Chris Kraft, proposed an audacious alternative: send Apollo 8 to the moon without the lunar module. Just the command and service modules. Don't land, but orbit the moon. Take photographs, scout landing sites, and come home. It would be humanity's first journey to another world. The proposal was risky. The Saturn V had flown successfully only twice, and one of those flights had problems. The redesigned Apollo command module had flown only once with crew, and that was in Earth orbit. Now they wanted to send 3 men 250,000 miles from home, put them in lunar orbit, and bring them back. If anything went wrong, there would be no rescue. They would die in space, and the world would watch helplessly. But the potential payoff was enormous. If successful, it would be one of the greatest achievements in history and would put America clearly ahead in the moon race. The crew selected was Frank Borman, commander, Jim Lovell, who had flown twice on Gemini, and Bill Anders, a rookie. They had just months to prepare for a mission far more ambitious than originally planned. They would be the first humans to ride the Saturn V, the first to leave Earth orbit, the first to see the far side of the moon, the first to witness Earthrise. The pressure was immense, but all 3 accepted immediately. Apollo 8 launched on December 21, 1968. The Saturn V performed perfectly, its 5 F-1 engines creating a controlled explosion that shook the ground for miles. The astronauts were pressed into their seats with 3 times the force of gravity. The first stage burned for 2.5 minutes, lifting them to 42 miles altitude, then separated. The second stage ignited, pushing them higher and faster. Then the third stage put them into Earth orbit. After 2 orbits spent checking systems, Mission Control gave them the go for translunar injection. The third stage engine relit, accelerating them to over 24,000 miles per hour, fast enough to escape Earth's gravity. They were committed now. They were going to the moon. The journey took 3 days. As Earth shrank behind them, the astronauts performed navigation checks, course corrections, and systems tests. They also became the first humans to see Earth as a complete sphere floating in space. The pictures they took, particularly one showing Earth rising above the lunar horizon, would become some of the most famous photographs ever taken. That image of our fragile blue world against the blackness of space would help inspire the environmental movement. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 swung behind the moon. They lost radio contact, disappearing behind the far side, where no human had ever been. For 34 minutes, they were completely alone, out of communication with Earth. When they emerged, they fired their engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. The burn had to be perfect. Too long, and they would crash into the moon. Too short, and they would fly off into space. The engine fired for exactly the right duration. They were in lunar orbit, 69 miles above an alien world. For the next 20 hours, they orbited the moon 10 times. They photographed potential landing sites. They studied the surface through their windows. Anders described it as a vast, lonely expanse of nothing that looked like dirty beach sand. The far side was particularly desolate, heavily cratered with no sign of the dark Maria that marked the near side. They provided detailed descriptions for future landing missions. But they also did something else, something unplanned that would resonate across Earth. On their 9th orbit, during a live television broadcast on Christmas Eve, the most-watched TV program to that point in history, the 3 astronauts took turns reading from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, Borman began. They described the moon's stark beauty while reading the biblical creation story. Their words transmitted across 250,000 miles of space to a world watching in wonder. Anders concluded, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." The broadcast was remarkable for what it revealed about how this mission affected even the astronauts themselves. They had traveled farther than any humans in history. They had seen sights no one had seen before. And their main message wasn't about technology or achievement. It was about the beauty and fragility of Earth and humanity's place in the cosmos. After their 10th orbit, on Christmas morning, they fired their engine again for trans-Earth injection, the burn that would bring them home. Again, they were behind the moon, out of contact. If the engine failed, they would be trapped in lunar orbit with no way home. It fired perfectly. When they emerged and re-established contact, Lovell's laconic message to Mission Control became famous. "Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus." They returned to Earth on December 27th, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. President Johnson called it the most significant achievement in history since creation itself. Time magazine named the crew there Men of the Year. The mission's success was complete. America had sent humans to another world and brought them safely home. The psychological impact was profound. If America could do this, landing on the moon seemed not just possible but inevitable. The Soviets were shocked and demoralized. They had been planning their own circumlunar flight, but Apollo 8 had beaten them decisively. Their response was muted. They couldn't match what America had just achieved. Their N-1 rocket was still untested and having serious problems. Their program was falling further behind with each American success. Apollo 9 followed in March 1969, staying in Earth orbit, but testing the lunar module with crew for the first time. James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart spent 10 days putting the lunar module through its paces. They undocked from the command module, flew separately, practiced rendezvous and docking. The lunar module, nicknamed Spider for its ungainly appearance, worked beautifully. Schweickart also performed a spacewalk testing the backpack that astronauts would use walking on the moon. Then came Apollo 10 in May 1969, the full-dress rehearsal. Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan flew to the moon, entered orbit, and Stafford and Cernan took the lunar module, named Snoopy, down to within 9 miles of the lunar surface. They flew over the planned landing site for Apollo 11, taking photographs and testing all procedures except the actual landing. At their closest approach, they were traveling at over 3,000 miles per hour, just above the lunar mountains and craters. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Everything worked. The only thing left was to actually land. NASA selected Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to make that landing, with Michael Collins as command module pilot. Armstrong was a civilian test pilot, calm under pressure, with a reputation for ice-cold nerves. During Gemini 8, When a thruster malfunction sent his spacecraft into a potentially fatal spin, he had saved the mission through quick thinking. He had also ejected from a lunar landing training vehicle seconds before it crashed. If anyone could land on the moon, it was Armstrong. Aldrin was a brilliant engineer with a doctorate from MIT. He had worked out the orbital mechanics for rendezvous and docking. On Gemini 12, he had proven spacewalking could be done effectively. Collins, a Gemini 10 veteran, would orbit the moon alone while his crewmates descended to the surface. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. Over 1 million people gathered at Cape Kennedy to watch. Millions more watched on television worldwide. The Saturn V performed flawlessly, as it always had. The journey to the moon was smooth. On July 19th, they entered lunar orbit. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, named Eagle, and separated from the command module Columbia. Collins continued orbiting while his crewmates began their descent. The landing almost didn't happen. As Eagle descended, Armstrong realized they were heading for a boulder field. The automatic guidance was taking them to a catastrophically bad landing site. He took manual control, burning precious fuel to fly horizontally, searching for a smooth spot. Mission Control watched the fuel gauge dropping. 90 seconds of fuel remaining. 60 seconds. 30 seconds. Armstrong found a clear area and set Eagle down with less than 25 seconds of fuel left. His heart rate, monitored by telemetry, barely increased. His voice, transmitted across space, was steady. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Mission Control erupted in cheers. Charlie Duke, the capsule communicator, could barely get his response out. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Around the world, people who had been holding their breath let it out. They had done it. Humans had landed on the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin were supposed to sleep before going outside, but no one could sleep. After several hours of checks and preparations, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. At the bottom, he pulled a cord that deployed a television camera. Grainy, ghostly images appeared on screens around the world. 600 million people, more than a fifth of Earth's population, watched as Armstrong stepped off the ladder onto the lunar surface. His words were carefully chosen. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Static obscured the A before man, making the grammar slightly off, but the meaning was clear. Humanity had arrived. Aldrin joined him 20 minutes later. For 2.5 hours, they explored, planted an American flag, collected rock samples, set up scientific instruments, and talked to President Nixon via radio telephone. They described the beauty and strangeness of the moon. The soil was fine like powder. The horizon was close and sharp. The sky was black even in daylight, because there's no atmosphere to scatter light. Earth hung in that black sky, a brilliant blue and white marble, impossibly beautiful and far away. They left behind a plaque attached to the lunar module's descent stage. It read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." The message was optimistic, perhaps naive, but it captured the spirit of the moment. This wasn't just an American achievement. It was a human achievement. Yes, America had won the race, but in winning, they had elevated all of humanity. The return journey was tense. Eagle had to lift off from the moon using an engine that had never been fired before and couldn't be tested. If it failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded. It fired perfectly. They rendezvoused with Collins in Columbia, transferred the rock samples, and jettisoned Eagle. The trip home took 3 days. On July 24th, they splashed down in the Pacific. They were immediately quarantined, in case they had brought back lunar microbes, though everyone knew this was unlikely. The reaction worldwide was euphoric. Cities held parades. Foreign leaders sent congratulations. Even the Soviet Union officially praised the achievement, though privately they were devastated. They had lost the race. All their efforts, all their early achievements, had culminated in watching America accomplish what they could not. The Apollo 11 astronauts went on a world tour, meeting leaders and crowds that numbered in the millions. They became, for a brief moment, the most famous people on Earth. Kennedy's promise had been fulfilled with 5 months to spare. America had landed men on the moon and returned them safely. The most ambitious technological undertaking in history had succeeded. The space race, at least its first chapter, was over. America had won. Apollo 11 had achieved the impossible, and now NASA faced an unexpected problem. What comes after the greatest accomplishment in human history? The answer was to keep going. 5 more moon landings were planned. The hardware existed. The astronauts were trained. And there was still so much to learn about our nearest neighbor in space. But public attention was already drifting. We had won the race. What was the point of going back? Apollo 12 launched in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. The crew consisted of Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. Conrad was a veteran of 2 Gemini flights, known for his humor and skill. The mission seemed routine, almost anticlimactic after Apollo 11, until 36 seconds after launch. The Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning, then struck again. Electrical systems went haywire. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. In mission control, flight controllers saw telemetry go chaotic. The mission seemed doomed. But John Aaron, a young flight controller, remembered an obscure switch setting from a training simulation. He told the crew to set signal conditioning electronics to auxiliary. Conrad had no idea what that meant, but lunar module pilot Alan Bean did. He flipped the switch. The systems reset. Telemetry returned. The mission was saved by institutional memory and a single flight, controller's recall of an obscure simulation. They continued to the moon. Conrad and Bean landed at the Ocean of Storms, near the site where the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe had landed 2 years earlier. They made a precision landing, touching down just 600 feet from Surveyor. Conrad's first words stepping onto the moon were characteristic. Whoopee. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. A reference to his shorter stature. They spent over 7 hours outside over 2 moonwalks, collecting rocks, setting up experiments, and retrieving parts from Surveyor 3 to study how materials weathered in the lunar environment. The mission was a complete success, proving Apollo 11 wasn't a fluke. Apollo 13 in April 1970 was supposed to land at from Morrow Highlands. The crew was Jim Lovell, making his 4th spaceflight, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. 2 days into the mission, while they were nearly 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The spacecraft shuddered. Warning lights flashed. Lovell's famous understatement to mission control became iconic. Houston, we've had a problem. The explosion crippled the service module, destroying one oxygen tank and damaging another. The command module, which relied on the service module for power and life support, was dying. The moon landing was immediately canceled. The only question now was whether the crew could survive long enough to get home. They couldn't turn around in space. Their only option was to loop around the moon and use its gravity to slingshot back to Earth. The crew moved into the lunar module, designed to support 2 people for 2 days. Now it had to support 3 people for 4 days. They shut down nearly everything to conserve power. The temperature dropped to near freezing. Condensation formed on the walls. Carbon dioxide levels rose dangerously because the lunar module's scrubbers couldn't handle 3 people. Engineers on the ground improvised a solution using plastic bags, cardboard, and duct tape. The crew built a makeshift adapter, and it worked. For 4 days, the world watched and prayed. Would they make it? Could the lunar module's engine perform the necessary burns to correct their trajectory? Would the command module's systems work after being shut down in the cold of space? Would the heat shield, possibly damaged by the explosion, protect them during re-entry? No one knew. The crew was cold, exhausted, and dehydrated. Lovell lost 14 pounds. But they kept working, following procedures developed on the fly by Mission Control. On April 17th, they jettisoned the service module and saw for the first time the extent of the damage. An entire panel was blown off. It was amazing they had survived. They transferred back to the command module, powered it up, and jettisoned the lunar module that had saved their lives. Lovell called it a tough little bird. They re-entered Earth's atmosphere. The heat shield held. Parachutes deployed. They splashed down safely in the Pacific. The mission was called a successful failure. They hadn't landed on the moon, but they had survived what should have been a fatal disaster. Apollo 13 had a strange effect on public interest. Suddenly people cared about the moon missions again. The near tragedy reminded everyone how dangerous space travel was, and how remarkable it was that we could bring 3 men home from the brink of disaster across 250,000 miles of space. But it also raised questions. Was it worth the risk to keep going back? NASA reviewed everything after Apollo 13. The oxygen tanks were redesigned, procedures were improved, and the missions continued. Apollo 14 in January and February 1971 finally completed the mission Apollo 13 couldn't, landing at Framaro. The crew was Alan Shepard, America's first man in space, now getting his chance to walk on the moon, Ed Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa. At 47, Shepard was the oldest person to walk on the moon. He also hit golf balls on the lunar surface using a makeshift club, one of the most famous light moments of the Apollo program. The last 3 Apollo missions, numbers 15 through 17, were different from the earlier flights. These were J missions, featuring longer stays, more extensive scientific exploration, and a lunar rover, a battery-powered car that allowed astronauts to venture miles from their landing site. These missions transformed moon exploration from brief visits to substantial scientific expeditions. Apollo 15 in July and August 1971, commanded by David Scott, with James Irwin and Alfred Wardens, landed near Hadley Rill, a valley at the edge of a mountain range. Scott and Irwin spent 3 days on the surface, driving over 17 miles in the rover. They collected the Genesis rock, a sample over 4 billion years old that provided crucial information about the moon's formation. At the end of their final moonwalk, Scott performed a demonstration proving that in the moon's airless environment, a hammer and a feather would fall at the same rate. Both hit the ground simultaneously, validating Galileo's theory centuries after his death. Apollo 16 in April 1972, with John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly, landed in the Descartes Highlands. Young and Duke spent 3 days exploring, driving over 16 miles and collecting over 200 pounds of samples. Young was so enthusiastic he jumped and fell multiple times in the moon's low gravity. The images of astronauts bouncing around, clearly enjoying themselves, showed a side of lunar exploration the public hadn't seen much of before. Apollo 17 in December 1972 was the last. The crew was Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans. Schmitt was a geologist, the only scientist to walk on the moon. The mission landed in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, surrounded by mountains. Over 3 days, Cernan and Schmitt covered over 22 miles in the rover, collected the largest sample haul of any Apollo mission, and conducted extensive geological surveys. Schmidt's scientific training made the exploration particularly valuable. He could interpret what he was seeing in real time and make decisions about what to sample. On their final moonwalk, as they prepared to leave, Cernan spoke words that still resonate. As we leave the moon at Taurus-Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. He then became the last human to date to walk on the moon. That was December 14, 1972. No one has been back since. Why did the moon landings stop? The reasons were complex. The primary one was cost. Apollo was fantastically expensive, consuming over $25 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion in today's money. That represented nearly 5% of the federal budget at its peak. Congress wanted to redirect funding to social programs and dealing with issues on Earth. The Vietnam War was draining resources and public support. The economy was struggling. Spending billions to bring back moon rocks was increasingly hard to justify. Public interest had also waned dramatically. After Apollo 11, television networks didn't even broadcast some moon missions live. Apollo 13's crisis briefly reignited interest, but by Apollo 17, most Americans couldn't name the crew. The moon landings had become routine, somehow, even though they remained among the most dangerous and ambitious things humans had ever done. We had proven we could go to the moon. We had beaten the Soviets. The political imperative that drove Apollo had evaporated. NASA had planned missions through Apollo 20, but these were canceled. Three Saturn V rockets that had been built for lunar missions were repurposed. One would launch Skylab, America's first space station. The others were put on display at NASA facilities where they remain today, monuments to what might have been. The lunar roving vehicles driven by the last three missions remain on the Moon, along with the descent stages of 6 lunar modules, scientific instruments, flags, footprints, and various equipment. They sit unchanged in the airless environment, a museum of humanity's greatest adventure. The scientific legacy of Apollo was immense. The missions returned 842 pounds of lunar rock and soil. These samples have been studied for decades and continue to provide insights into the Moon's formation, age, and composition. The leading theory that the Moon formed from a Mars-sized body, colliding with early Earth, is based largely on Apollo samples. The experiments left on the lunar surface, including laser reflectors and seismometers, provided valuable data. We learned the Moon has a small core, experiences moonquakes, and is slowly moving away from Earth at about 1.5 inches per year. But Apollo's impact went beyond science. The program employed over 400,000 people at its peak. It drove innovations in computing, materials science, telecommunications, and manufacturing. Technologies developed for Apollo found their way into everyday life. Integrated circuits, cordless tools, freeze-dried food, and advanced insulation. The program demonstrated what humans could achieve when we committed to a seemingly impossible goal. Apollo also changed how we see ourselves and our planet. The photographs of Earth from space, particularly the Apollo 8 Earthrise image and the Apollo 17 blue marble photograph, became symbols of Earth's fragility and humanity's unity. Seeing our planet as a whole, without borders, floating in the cosmic void, inspired the environmental movement and shifted perspectives globally. Astronauts frequently reported that seeing Earth from space was a profoundly spiritual experience that gave them a sense of the interconnectedness of all life. The 12 men who walked on the Moon became part of history, though their lives afterwards varied widely. Neil Armstrong became reclusive, avoiding publicity, teaching engineering. Buzz Aldrin struggled with depression and alcoholism before becoming an advocate for space exploration. Some, like Alan Bean, became artists, painting lunar scenes from memory. Others, like John Young, stayed with NASA and flew on the space shuttle. Gene Cernan spent decades advocating for returning to the Moon. All of them, in various ways, struggled with being known primarily for a few days of their lives, extraordinary as those days were. By the end of 1972, humanity's first era of Moon exploration was over. We had accomplished something extraordinary. We had traveled to another world, walked on its surface, and returned safely 12 times out of 13 attempts. We had proven the impossible was possible, but we had also learned that capability alone wasn't enough to sustain exploration. Without political will, public support, and funding, even the greatest achievements could be abandoned. The question that lingered was whether we would ever return, or whether the footprints left in 1972 would remain undisturbed for centuries, monuments to a brief moment when humanity reached beyond Earth and then, inexplicably, stopped. For years, the Soviet Union maintained that they had never been in a race to the Moon. It was all American propaganda, they claimed. They had always been focused on space stations and robotic exploration. Landing humans on the Moon was dangerous, expensive, and scientifically unnecessary. This narrative persisted throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. But it was a lie. The Soviets had been desperately trying to beat America to the Moon, and they had failed spectacularly. The true story, hidden for decades, was one of brilliant engineering undermined by political infighting, inadequate funding, and catastrophic technical failures. The Soviet lunar program actually began before Kennedy's famous speech. Sergei Korolev had been dreaming of the Moon since the 1950s. He had sketched designs for lunar rockets and spacecraft, but getting approval and resources from Soviet leadership was difficult. Khrushchev was more interested in propaganda victories like Sputnik and Gagarin than in expensive long-term programs. The Soviet system also fostered competition between different design bureaus. Where NASA had unified command, the Soviets had rival groups fighting for funding and favor. When Kennedy announced America's lunar goal in 1961, Korolev pushed harder for approval. But it took until 1964 for the Soviet government to officially authorize a manned lunar program. By then, America had a 3-year head start. The Soviets would have to work faster, take more risks, and hope for American failures. They had 2 main programs, one to land cosmonauts on the moon, and another to simply fly around it and return, scoring a propaganda victory even if they couldn't land. The landing program required a giant rocket, something that could match or exceed the Saturn V. Korolev's design bureau developed the N-1, a massive rocket standing over 340 feet tall. It was an ambitious design, but it was also flawed from the start. The Americans had chosen to develop huge F-1 engines for the Saturn V, 5 of them producing enormous thrust. The Soviets couldn't develop engines that large in time. Instead, the N-1's first stage used 30 smaller engines clustered together. 30 engines meant 30 potential failure points. The plumbing required to fuel all of them was incredibly complex. Making matters worse, the Soviets never built test facilities large enough to fire all 30 engines together on the ground. The Saturn V's first stage was tested repeatedly at full power before it ever flew. The N-1's first stage would only be tested during actual launch attempts. This was incredibly risky, but building proper test facilities would have taken time and money the program didn't have. The pressure to catch up with America drove them to take shortcuts that would prove fatal. The N-1 also suffered from electronics and computer control problems. Coordinating 30 engines required sophisticated computers, but Soviet computer technology lagged behind America's. The guidance and control systems were never fully reliable, and as problems mounted, weight had to be cut from other areas to compensate. The spacecraft became less capable. Margins for error shrank. The whole program was being held together with determination and hope. Korolev died in January 1966, as we discussed earlier, and his death devastated the program. His successor, Vasily Mishin, was a talented engineer but lacked Korolev's political skills and visionary leadership. Under Mishin, the program struggled even more. Different design bureaus fought over resources. The Lunar Landing Program and the Circumlunar Program competed for funding and attention. Nobody had the authority or political weight to make final decisions and end disputes. The Circumlunar Program, using the Zond spacecraft launched on Proton rockets, came closer to success. Several Zond missions flew around the moon unmanned, testing systems and procedures. But they had consistent re-entry problems. The spacecraft would return too steeply, subjecting any cosmonauts aboard to crushing G-forces. Some test flights with biological specimens came back with the creatures dead from the stress. Other flights completely missed their landing zones, coming down in the ocean or even outside Soviet territory. The Soviets couldn't risk killing their cosmonauts in such a visible failure. By 1968, they were racing to send cosmonauts around the moon before Apollo 8. They didn't make it. Apollo 8's success in December 1968 ended any chance the Soviets had of achieving that first. All that remained was the moon landing itself. If the N-1 worked, they might still win. But the N-1 had never flown successfully. Everything depended on it working perfectly on early flight tests. It wouldn't. The first N-1 launch attempt came on February 21, 1969, 4 months before Apollo 11. The rocket lifted off, and for 69 seconds everything seemed fine. Then a fire broke out in the engine compartment. Vibrations from failing engines damaged fuel lines. More engines failed in a cascade. At 70 seconds, the automatic abort system shut down all engines. The massive rocket fell back and crashed about 30 miles from the launch pad. The explosion was enormous, but because the launch was secret, the West knew nothing about it. The second launch attempt was on July 3, 1969, just 2 weeks before Apollo 11. This time the failure was even more catastrophic. The rocket began to lift off, rose barely 100 feet, then fell back onto the launch pad. The explosion was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The blast wave destroyed the launch complex, obliterated surrounding facilities, and could be seen from miles away. Amazingly, nobody was killed, though many were injured. The launch pad was so damaged it took 18 months to rebuild. American spy satellites photographed the destruction, but didn't know what had caused it. The CIA suspected a launch failure, but lacked details. The Soviets, of course, said nothing publicly. 16 days after this disaster, Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon. The Soviet dream of beating America had died on that launch pad, though they couldn't yet admit it even to themselves. There would be 2 more N-1 launches, both failures. The third attempt in June 1971 made it to 51 seconds before engine failures triggered a shutdown and explosion. The fourth and final launch in November 1972, a year after Apollo 15 and weeks before Apollo 17, actually performed better. It reached 107 seconds of flight before control problems caused it to tumble and break apart. 4 launches, 4 failures, and no N-1 ever reached orbit. The program was canceled in 1974. The cost of these failures, both financial and psychological, was enormous. Each N-1 represented years of work and massive resources. Each explosion destroyed not just the rocket, but months of effort rebuilding the launch facilities. And each failure made it clearer that the Soviets had lost the moon race decisively. The engineers and cosmonauts who had worked on the program were devastated. Many had devoted their careers to reaching the moon. Watching America succeed while they failed again and again was crushing. The Soviet lunar landing program also developed a lunar module equivalent called the LK. It was smaller than the American lunar module, designed for only 1 cosmonaut. The lone cosmonaut would land, spend a few hours on the surface, and return. No second person to help if something went wrong. No backup in case of emergencies. It was riskier than the American approach, but it saved weight. Several LK spacecraft were built and tested, but they never flew to the moon because there was no rocket to carry them. The cosmonauts trained for missions that would never happen. They had practiced in simulators, studied lunar maps, and prepared for every contingency. Some, like Alexei Leonov, were specifically assigned to land on the moon. They knew they were in a race, and they wanted desperately to win. But they also saw the problems mounting, the failures accumulating, and the American program pulling further ahead. By 1969, most understood they would never walk on the moon. The realization was bitter. After the American moon landings, the Soviet Union shifted to a different strategy: unmanned lunar exploration. If they couldn't land cosmonauts, they could still demonstrate technological capability with robots. In September 1970, Luna 16 landed on the moon, collected samples, and returned them to Earth. It was the first robotic sample return mission. A few months later, in November 1970, Luna 17 delivered Lunocode 1, a robotic rover that explored the lunar surface for months, covering over 6 miles. These were genuine achievements, remarkable feats of robotic engineering. The Soviets claimed they demonstrated that human missions to the moon were unnecessary. Robots could do the work more safely and cheaply. But everyone understood this was saving face. The robotic missions were impressive, but they weren't replacements for human exploration. They were consolation prizes. Luna 16 returned about 3.5 ounces of lunar material. Apollo missions returned hundreds of pounds. Lunocode 1 drove 6 miles over nearly a year. Apollo 17 covered more than that in 3 days. The full extent of the Soviet lunar program remained classified for years. Western intelligence knew something had failed, but not the details. Soviet cosmonauts couldn't talk about it. Engineers kept silent. Official histories pretended the program never existed. It wasn't until the late 1980s, during Glasnost under Gorbachev, that details began to emerge. Former cosmonauts gave interviews. Engineers published articles. Documents were declassified. The world finally learned that the race to the moon had been real, competitive, and much closer than it appeared. Some historians argue the Soviets never had a real chance. The American industrial base was stronger. NASA's budget, while controversial in America, dwarfed what the Soviets could allocate. The Apollo program employed hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of states. The Soviets simply couldn't match that scale. Others argue the Soviets could have won if they had committed earlier, avoided political infighting, and properly funded their program. If Korolev had lived longer, if the N-1 had been tested properly, If the various design bureaus had cooperated instead of competed, perhaps the outcome would have been different. What's certain is that the Soviet failure wasn't due to lack of skill or dedication. Soviet engineers were brilliant. Soviet cosmonauts were brave and capable. But they were working within a system that made success extraordinarily difficult. The political environment discouraged cooperation, encouraged secrecy even within the program, and punished failure harshly. Funding was always insufficient. Deadlines were impossible. Quality control was inadequate. And the pressure to score propaganda victories often overrode sound engineering judgment. The legacy of the Soviet lunar program is complex. On one hand, it represents one of the great failures in space exploration history. Billions of rubles spent, years of effort, and nothing to show for it but crashed rockets and unfulfilled dreams. The cosmonauts who trained to walk on the moon never got their chance. The engineers who designed the N-1 watched it explode 4 times. The program became a symbol of Soviet decline, evidence that the communist system couldn't compete with American capitalism in major technological challenges. On the other hand, the program pushed boundaries and achieved remarkable things. The early Soviet space firsts, Sputnik, Gagarin, Leonov spacewalk, were genuine breakthroughs that drove the entire space age forward. The robotic Luna and Lunocode missions demonstrated capabilities in automated exploration that influenced later planetary probes. And the failure of the N-1, painful as it was, provided lessons about rocket design and testing that influenced future programs. The cosmonauts who never flew to the moon carried that disappointment for the rest of their lives. Leonov, who would have been the first Soviet to walk on the moon if the N-1 had worked, spent decades afterwards advocating for renewed lunar exploration. He maintained that the moon still held mysteries worth investigating. He wanted to see humans return, whether American, Russian, or from any nation. His message was that the moon race, for all its Cold War competition, had ultimately been about human achievement, not just national pride. The Soviet lunar program remained a closely guarded secret, a source of embarrassment and regret. But it was also a testament to human ambition, the desire to explore and achieve even against impossible odds. The engineers and cosmonauts who worked on it deserved better than failure, but they never gave up. They pushed technology forward, inspired future generations, and showed that even in defeat, there can be honor in the attempt. The N-1 never reached space, but the dream that drove its creation, the dream of touching another world, was shared by both sides of the Iron Curtain, proving that some aspirations transcend politics. The moon landings ended, but the Cold War continued. The superpowers still faced each other across ideological divides, still maintained massive nuclear arsenals, still competed globally for influence. Yet something had changed. The space race, that most visible and dramatic arena of competition, was evolving into something unexpected: cooperation. The shift didn't happen because tensions eased, they hadn't, but because both nations recognized that the costs of competition were becoming unsustainable and the benefits of cooperation were increasingly apparent. By the early 1970s, both space programs were changing direction. NASA was developing the Space Shuttle, a reusable spacecraft that promised to make space access routine and affordable. The promise would prove optimistic, but the concept represented a fundamental shift from expendable capsules to reusable vehicles. The Soviets were focusing on space stations, building on their Salyut program to create long-duration orbital laboratories. Both nations were moving away from spectacular one-off achievements toward sustained presence in space. The political climate was also shifting. Nixon and Brezhnev were pursuing détente, a relaxation of Cold War tensions. Trade agreements were being negotiated. Arms control talks were progressing. And within this broader thaw, space cooperation became possible. The symbolism was powerful. If American and Soviet spacecraft could meet in orbit, if astronauts and cosmonauts could work together in space, perhaps the nations themselves could find common ground on Earth. The idea for a joint mission emerged from discussions in 1972. The mission would be called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, and it would involve docking an American Apollo command module with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in Earth orbit. The crews would transfer between vehicles, conduct joint experiments, and demonstrate that space rescue operations between different systems were possible. More than the technical goals, the mission would be a gesture of cooperation, a visible symbol that the space race could end not with one side conquering the other, but with both sides working together. The technical challenges were substantial. American and Soviet spacecraft used different docking mechanisms, different atmospheric pressures, different electrical systems, and, of course, the crews spoke different languages. Engineers from both nations worked together to design a docking module that could serve as an airlock between the two vehicles, allowing crews to transfer without equalizing the entire cabin pressures. This required compromise on both sides, sharing technical information that had previously been closely guarded secrets. The cultural challenges were equally significant. American astronauts traveled to Moscow for training. Soviet cosmonauts came to Houston. They toured each other's facilities, studied each other's systems, and gradually built relationships. Tom Stafford, the American commander, learned Russian. Alexei Leonov, the Soviet commander, improved his English. They discovered they had more in common than dividing them. Both were pilots, both loved flying, both believed in the importance of space exploration. The Cold War politics that separated their nations seemed increasingly abstract when they were working side by side on spacecraft procedures. Apollo-Soyuz launched in July 1975. Soyuz 19 with Leonov and Valery Kubasov lifted off first from Baikonur. 7.5 hours later, Apollo launched from Kennedy Space Center with Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand. Slayton had been one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, but had been grounded for years due to a heart condition. At 51, he was finally getting his chance to fly in space. The two spacecraft maneuvered toward each other over 2 days, performing rendezvous procedures developed during Gemini and perfected during Apollo. On July 17th, 2 days after both launches, the spacecraft docked. Stafford guided Apollo carefully into the docking module attached to Soyuz. The mechanisms engaged, locks secured, and for the first time, American and Soviet spacecraft were joined in orbit. 3 hours later, after checking seals and equalizing pressure, the hatches opened. Stafford and Leonov shook hands in the docking module, two former adversaries meeting as colleagues and friends. The image was broadcast worldwide. The moment represented not an ending of competition, but a transformation of it into cooperation. For 2 days, the spacecraft remained docked. Crews transferred between vehicles, sharing meals, conducting joint experiments, and participating in television broadcasts. They signed certificates, exchanged flags and gifts, and spoke about the importance of international cooperation. The symbolism sometimes felt forced, carefully scripted for political purposes, but the genuine warmth between the crews was evident. These weren't politicians reading statements. These were pilots and engineers who had trained together and respected each other's skills. The missions concluded successfully. The spacecraft undocked, performed a second docking to test procedures, then separated permanently. Soyuz 19 landed in Kazakhstan on July 21st. Apollo splashed down in the Pacific on July 24th. The mission was hailed as a triumph of détente, proof that cooperation in space was possible. But it was also, in many ways, an ending. Apollo-Soyuz was the last flight of an Apollo spacecraft. It marked the conclusion of an era that had begun with Sputnik 18 years earlier. The space race had fundamentally changed both nations and the world. The technological advances were obvious. Satellites revolutionized communications, weather forecasting, and navigation. Computer technology advanced decades and years. Materials science, medicine, and countless other fields benefited from space program innovations. But the impacts went far beyond technology. The space race transformed education. In America, the shock of Sputnik led to massive investment in science and math education. The National Defense Education Act poured billions into schools and universities. A generation of scientists and engineers were trained, many specifically because they were inspired by the space program. The Soviets similarly invested heavily in technical education, though they had always emphasized it. Both nations understood that technological competition required educated populations. The space race changed culture and society. Science fiction became mainstream. Children who had grown up watching rocket launches and moon landings entered adulthood with different expectations about the future. Technology was no longer something to fear, but something that could solve problems and open new frontiers. This optimism about technology's potential, for better or worse, shaped late 20th century thinking. The space race also changed international relations and perceptions of national power. Military strength still mattered, but technological sophistication mattered too. Nations could demonstrate their capabilities, not just through weapons, but through achievements in space. This created new forms of competition, but also new possibilities for cooperation. Space became an arena where nations could compete without killing each other, where victories were measured in discoveries rather than body counts. The environmental movement was profoundly influenced by space exploration. The photographs of Earth from space, showing our planet as a fragile oasis in the cosmic void, help people understand our interconnectedness and vulnerability. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970 during the Apollo program. The connection wasn't coincidental. Seeing Earth from space changed how we thought about our planet and our responsibility to protect it. But the space race also had costs, both financial and in terms of priorities. The billions spent on reaching the moon were billions not spent on poverty, healthcare, education, or infrastructure on Earth. Critics argued then and now that space exploration was a luxury, a waste of resources that should have been directed to more immediate human needs. The debate about whether space exploration is worth its cost continues, with valid arguments on both sides. The space race's end in the mid-1970s left both programs searching for purpose. The United States would spend the next decades focused on the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. The Soviet Union and later Russia would continue operating space stations, eventually contributing to the International Space Station. Both nations would conduct robotic exploration of the solar system. But never again would space exploration have the urgency, the political importance, or the public attention it commanded during the 1960s. Some argue the space race's end was inevitable, that once the political motivations disappeared, space exploration would necessarily become more modest and practical. Others believe the end was a failure of imagination, that we should have continued outward from the moon to Mars and beyond. The fact that no human has left low Earth orbit since 1972, over 50 years ago, seems almost incomprehensible. We had the capability to reach the moon and chose to stop using it. The legacy of the space race is complex and sometimes contradictory. It demonstrated human capability at its finest: ingenuity, courage, persistence, and the ability to achieve seemingly impossible goals. It also demonstrated human nature at its most problematic: competition driven by fear, massive expenditures motivated by national pride rather than scientific curiosity, and the difficulty of sustaining effort once political motivations fade. For those who lived through it, the space race remains a defining memory. They remember where they were when Gagarin flew, when Armstrong stepped onto the moon. They remember the excitement, the fear, the pride, and the wonder. For later generations, who only know it through history, the space race can seem almost mythological, a time when humans did extraordinary things that we somehow can't replicate today despite having far more advanced technology. The hardware from that era remains as monuments. Saturn V rockets stand at NASA facilities, too precious to risk and too expensive to fly again. The lunar modules on the moon's surface wait in airless preservation. The footprints left by 12 astronauts are unchanged and will remain so for millions of years until micrometeorites and radiation slowly erase them. These artifacts stand as testament to what was achieved and what was left unfinished. The space race of the 20th century lasted roughly from 1957 to 1975, barely 18 years. In that brief period, humanity went from having never left Earth to landing on another world. The pace of achievement was breathtaking and has never been matched since. Whether we will ever see such rapid advancement again remains an open question. New space races are emerging, involving different nations and private companies, but none yet capture the drama and significance of that original competition. Perhaps the most important legacy is simply that the space race proved space exploration was possible. Before Sputnik, space travel was science fiction. After Apollo, it was history. We know we can leave Earth, because we've done it. We know we can walk on other worlds, because 12 people did exactly that. The space race gave humanity concrete proof that our future extends beyond this one planet. Whatever we do with that knowledge, however long it takes us to venture outward again, the space race showed us that the choice is ours. The cosmos is vast, challenging, and waiting. The question isn't whether we can explore it. We proved we could. The question is whether we will.